روسيا الاتحادية. كيف تنظر إلى قضايا الشرق الأوسط؟ العلاقة الاستراتيجية مع إيران وموقفها من البرنامج النووي، تدخلها العسكري في سوريا وأثره في صراعات المنطقة، علاقاتها مع تركيا وتضارب المصالح بينهما، تقاربها مع دول الخليج ورؤيتها لأمنه في ظل الوجود الأمريكي، اتفاقها مع أوبك لتنظيم أسعار النفط. روسيا الاتحادية، المسارات والاتجاهات المستقبلية في تعاملها مع ملفات الشرق الأوسط. هذه المواضيع وغيرها نناقشها ضمن محاضرتنا بعنوان المنظور الروسي تجاه قضايا الشرق الأوسط مع البروفيسور فيتالي نعومكن، رئيس معهد الدراسات الشرقية في الأكاديمية الروسية للعلوم بجمهورية روسيا الاتحادية.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أصحاب السعادة، السيدات والسادة، معكم أخوكم محمد الظهوري. أتشرف اليوم نيابة عن سعادة الدكتور سلطان النعيمي، مدير عام مركز الإمارات للدراسات والبحوث الاستراتيجية، أن أرحب بكم في هذا الصباح بمحاضرة مهمة وشيقة تحت عنوان المنظور الروسي تجاه قضايا الشرق الأوسط، يلقيها أحد القامات الفكرية المهمة من جمهورية روسيا الاتحادية، البروفيسور فيتالي نعومكن. يشغل البروفيسور فيتالي منصب رئيس معهد الدراسات الشرقية في الأكاديمية الروسية للعلوم، كما أنه أستاذ ورئيس كلية السياسات الدولية بجامعة موسكو الحكومية، التي حصل منها على شهادة الدكتوراه عام 1972. وقد أسهم منذ ذلك الحين في أكثر من 600 مقال وإصدار بشأن موضوعات تتعلق بتاريخ آسيا والعالم العربي والعلاقات الدولية. ويتولى منذ عام 2016 منصب مستشار سياسي أول لمبعوث الأمم المتحدة الخاص إلى سوريا، وهو عضو في المجلس الأكاديمي التابع لمجلس الأمن الروسي، كما يعمل في المجلس الأكاديمي التابع لوزارة الخارجية الروسية. وقد حصل البروفيسور نعومكن على جوائز تكريمية، من بينها جائزة الدولة لروسيا الاتحادية.
Ladies and gentlemen, Russia is one of the most important countries in the current international system on the international level and Middle East particularly throughout history. So, integral understanding of the Russian perspective is a requirement for decision making. And to understand, we must have meetings with the intellectuals, and we are happy to host Professor Vitali. We are all eager, Professor Vitali, to know what we are going to discuss to enrich our knowledge. So please present your perspective and the Russian perspective of Middle East issues. Peace be upon you. His Excellency Dr. Sultan Al-Nuaimi, His Excellency the Ambassador to Muhammad Jabir, Emirati Ambassador to Russia. Before anything, I would like to the Center for giving me the chance to talk about with the prominent experts in the political, military, and diplomatic fields, academic also, and I'm honored to express my personal viewpoint as an academic, and I'm not representing any official entity, whether the foreign ministry or any other department. And this is my personal view. This is my first observation for this lecture. I prefer to name it as talking, not lecture, because lecturing before such a presence is not necessary. Maybe they all know better than me about Russia and its perspective about the Arab world. I prefer that there is exchange in questions and answers later on, but I'd start in the beginning as introduction to express my opinion. And before anything, our world today, this time especially, is not ordered well, And the world issues are walking and developing in a difficult way to understand, especially, or predict what will happen a year or 2 years later. Who would ever think that this world would be a theater for this pandemic, as if there is a third world war between man and nature? Forests are burning, a drought, floods. For example, in our country, we have never witnessed before. And with these masks, these techniques and measures to protect man from this pandemic, this is also a feature of this current time we are living in. Crisis time, competition time, tough competition and competitiveness about resources, power, natural resources, authority and dominance, as if sometimes we are relapsing and going back to old ancient times. Though we are developing technologically, and I would say in the beginning, when I am talking in UAE, I feel I am talking with old friends. There are many similarities between UAE and Russia. The two countries are federal states, and the foreign policies for UAE and Russia these policy is based on diplomacy, political dialogue, and careful conciliation, peaceful settlements, and developing the relation with every other state, and to mediate in the regional conflicts, which are too many, we are witnessing now every day, and unfortunately endless conflicts. So, when I think of the Middle East, I remember when the Middle East, when I was a young man, we considered the Middle East before anything else. Some Arab countries, there are some other countries are essential. The Gulf states were still nascent, still young, and even they did not, before 1971, there were some important Syria, Iraq, Egypt. They were the pillars of the Arab world. But now, after what happened, the non-Arab states are taking the leadership, such as, in reality, they are developing away from internal crises. Israel, Iran, Turkey, these three states are, when we are talking to the academia and intellectuals and official people, they say that we are superior to the Arabs in the internal levels. Russia, in the recent years, it started to take care of the Middle East in an extraordinary way. After the disentanglement of the Soviet Union because of internal problems and issues that Russia was suffering in the 90s particularly, there was a vision for some that the Middle East is a forgotten region for Russia. That was not true, but Russia's resources and capabilities were limited. It was occupied. Russia was occupied by rearranging the internal issues inside the country. I don't like to name it the return of Russia to the region, but there are experts, many experts and politicians, they name it with this phrase. This is true up to some level because the priority of the Middle East on the scale of the foreign policy of Russia has become higher. When Russia in the beginning, I'm talking now, I'm not talking in the name of Russia. I'm talking on behalf of some intellectuals and a vast group of people who are studying the foreign policies, Middle East. There was a vision that Russia was looking towards the south. Three packages, Caucasus and Asia, which is distinguished by of basic importance for Russia. Then neighboring states for the Commonwealth, Turkey, Iran, and up to some limit Afghanistan, which is something different. Then Arab world, because the Arab world was far away a little bit, but later on the Arab world as part of the Middle East protruded of its economic and political standing, and when Russia could say that it became one of the greatest or superpower again, it started and put the Middle East in general, including Arab world, and particularly the Arab world, I can say, there are higher levels of these priorities in the foreign policy of Russia. Yet, it regarded the Middle East, unfortunately, a place for regional conflicts, intervention also of the foreign and external powers, which are many, which is, they started to exercise bigger pressure, especially on some regimes that they were suffering from dissents and competitions among different forces. And also terrorism became shaking the Islamic and Arab worlds. And as I said, that the necessity for combating terrorism pushed Russia to cooperate more with the partners in the Middle East. And we know that Russia played a big role in combating terrorism and succeeded in some states, at least, for example. Of course, for the situation in Syria, the relative peace, though it is not ultimate situation, but it is relative, quiet, and the victory, although incomplete, but it is still important. So combating terrorism in Syria was established and achieved because of the Russian participation, active participation. When I was thinking of what to say today, I was thinking of focusing on some of the main essential three features of the Russian politics in the Middle East. What is our perspective of the Middle East? This is something that needs more than 10 lectures at least, and honestly, and better to ask the politicians and President Putin in particular what he thinks of the Middle East. So I would focus on what does Russia do for all these matters of concern to Russia and in its relations with the Middle East. I think that the most important thing for Russia and the relations between Russia and the Middle East, and before anything the Arab world, Russia has relations almost with all countries, and this is a principle of the foreign policy of Russia. Russia is related and has relations, in fact, good relations with all the players in the Middle East, including the disputing countries. If we take Israel on one side, Iran on the other side, another example, Turkey and other countries who are in conflict with Turkey, big differences with Turkey. In fact, Israel and Palestine also on the Middle East, we don't find any power or any group or minority. Kurds, for example. Russia has a historical relation with the Kurds, Arab Kurds, and doesn't accept, of course, what some countries impose in regard of the dissension and the schism and building a state without agreement with the central governments where the Kurds live. Russia is cooperating with them, but against what is happening in Syria, when some countries encourage, some of our partners encourage of this separatist trend in Syria. And as I said, for Russia, this principle, the principle of cooperation with everyone, having relation with everyone, is an excellent principle. And analysts in America and Europe always, they are referring to this feature for Russian politics. Sometimes the Western countries don't have such relations, and in fact this affects the policy of such countries. Russia doesn't accept also the politics based on bases, as our partners in the West say, or the rules. We are advocates of we are the advocates of international laws and respecting these laws, and we are against the military base and the rules that superpowers are using in dealing with smaller countries, weaker countries. We respect sovereignty, we respect independence, and we are against any policy that targets toppling the regimes just because they are not happy with these regimes. I'm just making sure of the time. How much time? We have 4 minutes still for talk. This is very precise. I love precision. I can refer to some features in the remaining 4 minutes that there are, and among the diplomatic activity of Russia, as encouraging political dialogue, officially or non-officially, encouraging communications between the citizens and having direct communication between Russian leadership and the leaders of the region, including the many visits of the region leaders to Russia. There are some leaders who visited Russia many times. For King of Jordan, King Abdullah, King of Jordan, the president and the prime minister of Netanyahu, and Mr. Erdogan also. Turkey, as for Turkey, we have long, old and historical relations with Turkey. We had many wars with Turkey And now, between us and Turkey, we have excellent relations, although sometimes, of course, there are differences, political differences, as for the cause and the non-acknowledgement of Erdogan. For example, Mr. Erdogan sometimes he doesn't acknowledge that, and he always says that Crimea is part of Ukraine and not part of Russia. We understand that he has the right to have his own position, and we are cooperating with him despite some of the differences we have with Erdogan, especially also in the conflict and the internal conflicts and the crises, and cooperation with other countries to solve the internal conflicts and the crises, and resorting to the mediation expertise Russia enjoys in settling and mediating. For example, 55 years ago, during the Soviet Union, Russia or the Soviet Union could achieve big victory after negotiations with the Prime Minister of India, Shastri, and the Pakistani Ayub Khan, after the war between India and Pakistan. There was conciliation thanks to Russia, and that is known. And even if we look to our past, the Soviet Union in the 20s, for example, there was an initiative through diplomacy. It's diplomacy in attempting to go between the first Arab world, which Russia established relations with, which is the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. And Russia started to improve the relations with Saudi Arabia and Turkey, Iran, and many others. There were many efforts in this direction, and it is acknowledged by Saudi, our friend Saudis. Allow me to interrupt you. Just because of time, we want to use the time in questions. Firstly, thank you very much for the similarities you talked about between our country and Russia, and we are honored. It was a rich presentation. You talked about the importance of Arab through history, and non-Arab countries now are becoming more developed and more dominant. And you talked about the Soviet Union and being occupied with arranging its internal arrangements, and now there was a priority for the Russia to follow. You know, we are an intellectual center, and we need more knowledge. And you are a strategic center before anything else, right? No, that's right. Being a new Arab world, UAE, and we are an inextricable part of the Arab world. And with the development of the relations between UAE and Russia, and there is about the possibility of Putin's visit to Bahrain. What are the pillars of the Russian perspective of the Gulf security regarding the international developments, mainly speaking and particularly about the Iranian nuclear project? Russia started to look the Gulf region as important region and one of the most important regions in Asia, and considers this region as a new partner, a new player. And if you regard our relations with all the Gulf States Council, they are important for Russia after the disentanglement of the Soviet Union. Russia has become in good relations, and new relations, important relations, and Russia regards this region, that this region has a potential, especially after the United States has announced that it is important. It is now moving its focus on China, India, before anything else. Now there is a possibility for Russia to play an active role in these fields I mentioned, of which we can mention this proposal to build a regional system for security in the Gulf region. And I think that this proposal, I don't want to talk about it now in details because it is there on the internet of the Russian Foreign Ministry website, and as experts we organized a seminar, important seminar, where many countries took part from east and west in Russia. That took place recently, and we had the honor. So Dr. Sultan al-Naimi honored us with his presence, and I want you to read carefully this proposal because it expresses Russia's desire to have conciliations, and that UAE is moving in the right direction, in this direction towards conciliations, communication with all the powers, Israel, Iran, Turkey. This is, in my opinion, great achievements for the Gulf, especially with the technological development and also space technology cooperation for Russia and UAE. This is all important. And as we see, in Russians' perspective, UAE has become a leading state in the technology, economy, and important partner in the politics and policies. And as I said at last, that this proposal for the Gulf, collective Gulf security, needs to be focused and paid attention, and I would like you all to focus on this. Professor, I want you to focus on Iran because it is one of the concerns of the Gulf states. Let's talk about the nuclear projects. Russia supports Iran in Vienna negotiations previously and now. In the coming period, what is Russia's perspective for these negotiations regarding the stubbornness of Iran in its demands? This is unfortunate. This is unfortunate than what's happening in the negotiations, but I am hopeful, I am optimistic, because I consider Iran is a responsible country, big, major country. I don't want to evaluate what Iran is doing. Iran is an important state for Russia because it is a neighboring, big state with historical civilization. There are many governments in Iran, of course. And sometimes they are more liberal governments, sometimes more hardliners in the governments of Iran. But this is something for Iran. I always consider, my personal opinion, that we must build our policies towards and versus this matter on the grounds of international law, on the basis also of preventing the proliferation of nukes and the nuclear weapons in the world, principally, but also at the same time, we have to respect the interests, legitimate interests of the Iran for its national security. And I cannot say more than this because I am careful that progress of such negotiations, and as I said, I don't want to evaluate or assess the policies of the other states, especially the states we have good relations with. Now I'll move to the Iranian borders, since you don't want to tackle more about the nuclear project. Let's go back now to Taliban control of Afghanistan. What is Russia's perspective of Taliban? Does Russia believe that Afghanistan will meet the requirements of combating terrorism? This question, we need time to answer this. We need time. You have the time. But when the West was rejecting any communication with Taliban during the armed disputes and conflicts in Afghanistan, we, for 7 years, there were direct communication between the Russian diplomacy and Taliban movement, despite it was on the blacklist of Russia as extremist entity, and Taliban leaders came and visited Russia and negotiated with Russia about the useful matters with the Russian diplomacy in the foreign ministry of Russia, and that helped us to reach, after withdrawal of the American withdrawal, unplanned withdrawal, and the Afghans' victory, although we feel that we can first continue our support Afghani people, because the Afghani people is suffering of humanitarian issues, and I don't understand personally, I don't understand why our friends in America have frozen such relations and and 9.5 billion in the American banks that might help the Afghani people. I don't think that whatever the internal tensions and conflicts and Taliban movement is not unified. They are not living or having one agenda or a homogeneous leadership. We understand this well, but at the same time, I don't think that Taliban in its agenda is to attack the neighbors. Before anything, we are careful about the security in the lands of our partners, the direct partners of ours, Middle Asia, Caucasus lands and countries. Also, there are different policies. There are different policies for these countries, but we are building our, as I see our policies, as I said, we are building our strategies for Taliban, that we are supporting the Afghani people, helping the Afghani people to overcome the economic difficulties on one level, and on the other level, we don't acknowledge or recognize Taliban officially, but unofficially we are meeting with their leaders. There is embassy. We are communicating with them, and everything is developing. And we hope that Taliban movement will continue to change and develop and to transform into a power different from the previous Taliban of 1996. This is our hope, but we don't know who will win in these internal conflicts which are still going on. On the priority level, you mentioned Turkey is an important country for Russia. Concerning Turkey, what are the Russian mechanisms to manage the differences with Turkey? For example, there is difference in the Ukrainian file, Syrian file, and there is agreement for selling arms, and the Strategic Council of Russia and Turkey. How does Russia manage these differences? Honestly, this is simply because sometimes we have differences in the same family. The mutual interest and what we are connecting us with Turkey is more important than tearing us apart, as you mentioned, of such problems you just mentioned, and sometimes they are not, but by virtue of the Turkish-Russian cooperation, we have many achievements for combating terrorism and conflicts, crises in the Middle East. For example, if you take, for example, as an example, Libya, the Russian-Turkey agreement in Libya in 2014 helped in overcoming and ending the civil war in Libya. After there was Turkish army there, Khalifa Haftar progressing to Tripoli and advance and making his way to Tripoli, we imagined that civil war would come back again to this country. But in spite of these differences between us, Russia and Turkey could reach to agreement and nip in the bud this civil war. And this is the case with Syria. In Syria, there are still this trio axis, Turkey, Russia, Iran, who are the guarantors of the conciliation processes in this country. Yes, we are looking and we are waiting from Turkey more active role in combating terrorism and terrorist groups in Idlib province before anything else, but at least Turkey is working, doing many things and cooperating with Russia in the Syrian case, but there is a bigger problem than this, which is the existence of the Americans in the region of the eastern region of Euphrates side, in the eastern side regions. They encourage some Kurds and some tribes to have, which gives the Americans the right to control of the fuel and oil resources in Syria, and this is we consider illegitimate. Even though we take into account that we have great differences with the Americans to the degree and these differences cannot be solved unless there is a mutual cooperation between the two sides. Though we are cooperating with the Americans in the Syrian file, there are negotiations in a private, direct communications between the militaries of the two sides, and there is common effort to remove the chemical weapons in Syria. So we can cooperate even with the United States in spite of the differences about Ukraine and other states. Professor, you mentioned the Russian role in Libya. I'd like to focus on this. The understandings, the Algerian-Russian understandings and agreement, especially with the call to get the foreign fighters from Libya, and what is the possibility of the postponing the elections supposed to take place on the 24th? Yes, the elections was postponed, and personally, I wasn't optimistic and keen on these elections, although because there are too many differences between the candidates themselves. For example, there was an attempt to not allow for Khalifa Haftar or Saif al-Islam Gaddafi to be among the presidential candidates or nominees. And there are still some militias who don't participate in the political and electoral process, and these are some of the barriers in the election. And unfortunately, even the government, the temporary government presided by Mr. Dubaiba, unfortunately, the government could not achieve all its objectives after Berlin Conference in 2020. With the exception of the basic achievement, which is a ceasefire. At least the government did its best in this field, but there is no election law, final one. There is no final election law, and their competition sometimes is unfair as for some players, and the external influence is still there, and the government could not give up some mercenary who are coming from Africa before anything else, even the Europeans and France. I don't want to tire you with the political exceptions. The Turks say that they came to Libya, that they came by legitimate government invitation. There is difference between the external powers, but as I said, this is not the reason. The reason, there are many countries trying to intervene in the internal issues of Libya for its own benefit. Even that toppling of Al-Gaddafi regime itself, that was a result of the foreign and Western intervention that led to this catastrophe in this country. I will go to economy now. One last question. What are the future perspectives for Russia to build partnerships with the Middle East in energy sector? And Russia is building its first economic industrial region, especially in the Suez Canal region. This is an important project, and I think the Egyptian-Russian relations will develop more. And it started now, lately, the economic relations and discussing some economic projects with Iraq in the beginning. After 2003, these relations were semi-stable, and now Russia is willing more than ever to participate in the economic projects in Iraq and building many projects. And the Iraqis, on the same time, they are welcoming such a role of Russia. If we take UAE also, we can say that there are many big investment, especially with Sibur company, and this deal or transaction is one of the most important transactions in the energy sector. And as it is the case with other states, also Russia is taking part in supporting the Syrian people through humanitarian aids, though unfortunately some states, especially the Western states, they don't want to provide the needed support for the innocent people in Syria because they are living in the areas controlled by the government of Damascus. And in my opinion, this is not true. There are many goals, and there is a clear movement. And I'm trying to focus on the humanitarian aids and the return of the refugees. And I think this is very important for the economy in this state. But principally, Russia is building its economic relations with the Gulf states in a profitable way, and we are very optimistic. At the end, I would like, on behalf of His Excellency Dr. Sultan Al-Naimi, Director of Emirates Center for Strategic Studies, to thank Professor Vitali for his coming with us. And I would like to thank you all, and thank you again in another academic event. Thank you very much. Peace be upon you.
شكرا.